Well, welcome to Podcast Tips with Rob Greenlee. This is the live Thursday show. Thank you so much for joining me here. This is episode 17 for me tonight, and please stay with us for the full episode because we do have a giveaway coming up at the end of the show for some StreamYard merch, like a sweatshirt and a Puddles duck. So definitely stay with us here. I wanted to also announce that this show is also available now as an audio and video podcast in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So it's not a video podcast yet in Spotify, but it is an audio and video podcast in Apple Podcasts. And so it's spreading out across all of the ecosystem of podcast listening platforms. So I'm excited about that. So, this show is even a convergence strategy of sorts. And so tonight I have a very, very special guest that's coming in. Of course, every guest that I have on this show is special because they have a connection to me and I have a lot of respect for them. And tonight, we're going to dive into a very expansive area. It's going to be hard to cover every square inch of the planet, but we're going to give it a try of international aspects of podcasting and some of the trends that are important around that, as well as maybe what's important to you as a podcaster. So I want to welcome a terrific guest. His name is James Cridland. I'll pull him up on the stage here in a second. He's the editor of Pod News at podnews.net. And he's on the line with us from Australia. So it's in the morning time for him, I believe, on Friday. So it's great. But he publishes a daily newsletter that comes out and it's free. So you just go to podnews.net and you can actually get access to that. And I'll bring that a URL up on the screen during the show today. And he's also a podcast host. He's been a longtime podcaster and has been involved in creating podcasts since about 2005 or so, as well as is doing a daily and weekly podcast for Pod News as well. And he's a very busy guy and he's joining us from Australia. So let's bring him up on the screen. And James, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for asking. It's always an honor to be on the tallest man in podcasting's shows.
Really,
excellent.
I hold that honor. Is that what I
think you must do.
There's got to be somebody else.
And I think if we say it now, I think it automatically it's now fact. I think so. Yeah. It's really good to be on and great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. I mean, we've done a lot of stuff together, but there aren't as many podcast events anymore around. And I know you spend a lot of time going to podcast events all over the world that I don't actually get to go to. So I would like to go to as many as you do. And that gives you kind of a unique insight into what's happening. But before we jump into that too far, I wanted to mention that podnews.net has a subscriber base of over 30,000 people now. Congratulations, James, for
thank you.
Building that kind of a distribution of your newsletter. And I think you really changed the medium. I think when you brought kind of exposure to a global perspective on podcasting, which I think that the United States and North America was sorely short of, because I know I didn't have a lot of visibility to what was happening in Asia and down in Australia and in the UK and in Europe and places like that. And it's just been astounding to me how much this medium has expanded around the globe. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to bring up on the screen your kind of newsletter website so people could take a look at it. And if they, after the show today, if they wanted to go subscribe, it's, like I said, it's free and there's podcasts coming out as well in support of the newsletter. So if you want to listen versus just read, you can certainly do that here as well. So every day. Yeah, go ahead, James, if you wanted to comment here.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yes, so I've been doing this since 2017. And I think so. If you're expecting an Australian accent, sorry, I don't have one of those. I'm a Brit, and I grew up in the UK, but I've also worked for companies in Europe, in Canada, and in other places as well. I've lived here for 8 years or so now, and and I really felt that there was something there for podcast news in a very general way, but certainly having a look at podcasting outside of Brooklyn. There's a lot of podcasting that happens in Brooklyn, and that's absolutely fine. But I think actually having a look outside there is really interesting, and that goes for both geography, but also goes in terms of the type of podcaster that you are. So there's hopefully stuff in there every day. My events aren't loading. There's a concern. There's stuff in there every day from big podcasters, big podcasting companies, as well as from indies, from very small one person bands and that sort of thing. So so there's a bunch of stuff going on there.
Yeah, and there's listings in here for jobs in podcasting too, and then you keep a running tally going on of over the last week. A certain amount of podcasts were published with at least one episode, and it's been entertaining to watch this number go up and down every week. Is this updated daily? Is that what this is? Or
yeah, that's from the Podcast Index, and it's updated every day. And it's really the point of that is really showing how many active podcasts are there. There's a lot of debate on what an active podcast is, and in that particular case, that's podcasts that have posted a new episode in the past week. And really, if you're producing a podcast, you might be concerned by looking at some of the numbers and go, oh my goodness, I'm competing against 4.2 million or 2.8 million, depending on
that's not really the case.
And that really isn't the case. You're really competing with those podcasts, unless you're, a fiction podcaster, in which case things are a little bit different. But you're really competing against shows which are being updated regularly, and there aren't too many of those. In the same way as if you go into a bookshop, there aren't too many book series that are being actively worked on, and that's absolutely fine. But I think that's where the competition is. So it's always helpful just to learn that.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good perspective to think about is the how many podcasts are actually in all these directories versus how many of them are actually active. And when you do a search, let's say in Apple Podcasts or any of these platforms, what comes up, if you're looking for a show to subscribe to, is usually cluttered around a bunch of what I consider to be archival shows, right? And it's hard for listeners to always find content that's being currently updated or shows that are currently being updated. And I think that the industry needs to do a little bit better job of surfacing active shows.
No, absolutely. And to a great case in point, if you were to search the pod news directories for pod news, if you were going to search the podcast directories for pod news, then depending on which directory your app is using, sometimes you will see an app in there, a show in there called, I think it's called Pod News, and I think it comes from Latin America, and I think it was last updated 8 years ago. Sometimes that one appears higher than the Pod News Daily, which is a daily podcast which has been updated every day for the last 5 years or so. So, you're kind of looking at that. I think we've got a long way to go for podcast search, and I think that's one of the problems that a lot of people are trying to fix. There's some, interesting work going on in terms of the idea of a pod roll where I can recommend podcasts that I think you might be interested in, and maybe you could build something which is page rank related in terms of that. But there's a bunch of entertaining stuff there. But that's, if you want a problem to fix in the world of podcasting, that would be number one from my point of view.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's one of the things that really makes YouTube as a consumption platform really stand out, is that they really do, good or bad, depending on your view on it. The algorithms are pretty smart about finding content, but they also recommend archival content a lot as well. So it's kind of interesting. It's more of a focus on episodes rather than a focus on series or shows, right? Which is
and I guess it really depends on what you're searching for as well. But yeah, I mean, sometimes there's nothing wrong with finding a piece of archive content which is still, which is still current and still seems to work. But
right.
yeah, it's just the Apple rankings and the Apple charts normally work in terms of recency. There is some trending there which helps you find stuff which has been recently updated or which people are following recently. And the theory is that people won't follow too many old shows. So that's a good sort of scoring mechanism to use. But obviously it only works in the Apple ecosystem. And there are plenty of other ways of finding a podcast there. So I find, all of that sort of searching stuff fascinating, particularly since... we did an article a couple of years ago with Mark Steadman around what podcast apps are actually searching through. And it was always felt that the description, your show notes, your episode notes in particular, were really important. And if you put, who you were talking to in there and what you talked to them about and everything else, then that would help you in terms of the search engine. What we actually discovered is that Apple Podcasts certainly was not searching through your episode show notes at all.
Right. Right. No, that's true, and it's never.
So therefore, what was the point of doing that? And so and that may well have changed in the new version of Apple Podcasts, which probably comes out next week. But yeah, there's a lot of really obvious low-hanging fruit there, I think.
Yeah, and I wanted to also share the Pod News podcast as well here. It's up on the screen. It's so your website podnews.net also has a directory. So you can get in and find podcasts right off of Pod News as well. So it's basically a multi-purpose website. There's full articles in there too. You can find events. Actually this program is in there as well. If I were to go over to
oh, here we go. This is where something else breaks. Oh no, we're okay.
No, it's good. It's good.
Excellent.
The new podcast that I just launched just a few days ago is up on your site now. Is it propagated, I'm assuming, from Apple Podcasts?
It comes both from Apple and from the Podcast Index. So
Podcast
I actually
Index,
use both of those to pull those in. Yeah, absolutely. And because you're looking at this on a big screen, there's a QR code there which you can wave at your mobile phone to automatically.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Get that. My worry and my concern around this particular page is what do I do next month or later this month when Google Podcasts closes down? Do I just get rid of Google Podcasts here? What in terms of Android users, am I just going to give all of the traffic to Spotify? What's the deal there? Maybe I should be pointing to something else. Who knows? But that's going to be an interesting time to work out what I'm doing with these, individual pages.
Yeah, because if I go in and I look at this listing now, I mean, even with Podcast Tips podcast, this doesn't go to any listing in Google Podcasts. So it just could be that it hasn't propagated over there yet, but it's also on the verge of getting shut down. So there's not a lot of point to doing that at this point.
Yeah, no, indeed.
So,
indeed.
But also, the show's also in Spotify now. So if you wanted to follow the show on the on-demand side, it's all available up there.
Very cool.
So I'm officially now a podcast show, not just a live streaming show. So
I can think of many people who will be delighted.
Oh, really? You can. Like my co-host of my other show, Todd Cochran.
Your co-host of your other show, yes. He will no longer be saying, but it's not a podcast.
Yeah, it's not a podcast,
so,
right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, I think that this is an interesting thing. The definition of a podcast is certainly changing. And I think, I've always been of the opinion that whatever the audience wants to call it is what we should call it. It doesn't necessarily really matter if it's being delivered via RSS or not. Even I have been slightly pushed by the theory of a video podcast on YouTube only being a podcast. And I think there's some research which has been done which basically says if you can see the microphones, then it's a podcast, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about what a YouTube show is,
Well,
But yeah,
or actually even extend it over to what a podcast is. I mean, is it?
Well, indeed, yeah.
I've always struggled with it from the very early days, because in the early days, like I've said many times on this program, is back when video was big, that really it doesn't matter, right? I mean, video and audio has always been really supported in podcasting. I think now it's less supported, but with YouTube coming in, it's definitely brought it to the fore again, which is rather ironic because it was YouTube that caused video podcasting to decline. So
Yes.
it's almost like the worlds have kind of switch places.
Yes.
I don't know how else to describe it, but it's really kind of interesting to me, especially because back when I was working at Microsoft, I built a video podcast experience in Windows Media Center for televisions back in those days. So, video's always
what goes
been
around comes around.
right,
Yeah,
riding
yeah,
along with
absolutely.
this medium, and I think it's
And-
terrific. And you can see what I'm doing here is really embracing it and then also taking it to the next level and trying to do more live stuff
Yeah,
too.
indeed, and I think there's been a bunch of research. There's been a great piece of research recently from Signal Hill Insights, and one of the things that they say is that people listen to the same shows. They might watch it on video or listen to it on audio. It just depends on the time of day, depends what else they're doing. Spotify released some data not so long back, which seemed to show that video podcasts were really used in the evening. Really as a competitor to television, I guess. Whereas during the rest of the day, audio podcasts, reigns supreme, and you can kind of see that makes a bunch of sense. That actually you're going to get a ton of people who are busy during the day doing other things, but have a podcast on. It would be quite difficult to watch a show while I'm driving, to the supermarket or whatever. But in the evening, we've got a little bit more time to actually sit in front of a screen and watch stuff. So so I think it is fascinating seeing how this particular medium is changing and growing.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, that's my consumption pattern too. Is I'll listen to some shows on my phone, but most of the stuff I watch is on my big screen Roku television. So it's kind of an interesting balance. I do enjoy video. As you can see, I'm doing video, so I definitely enjoy it and like the community aspects of doing a live show too. Getting people commenting and getting people engaged in the show as well. And I know that I haven't really fully explained your background, but you've been around radio and online kind of companies and business for like 28 years and started the first daily podcast from a UK radio station, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes,
yeah.
back in March of 2005. So this was before iTunes had started doing podcasting. Before you were doing podcasting with the Microsoft the Microsoft Zune as well. I mean, I found the original RSS feed. It didn't even have a thumbnail image because, of course, that was something that Apple insisted on.
Right.
That was great fun to be working in the industry all that time. But yeah, my background is, as yours is, Rob, has a bit of radio in there, really understanding that hearing from your audience is a really important thing as well. And, as we've been speaking on the video version, you'll have seen all kinds of messages and things from people who are watching the live stream. And I think that's, part and parcel of what makes podcasting, live podcasting, really, really interesting. That, that you can actually see people coming in and talking about things that you are actually talking about right now. It's much the same as radio has been as well. And I think that it's going to be fascinating watching and seeing how live podcasting, as this is, works with individual podcast apps. There are some podcast apps which have that functionality inbuilt, and it'll be interesting to see how many more end up doing that too.
Yeah, and as we talk about kind of the next evolution of podcasting, it's very much could support, podcasting 2.0 could very much support video and live content. So that could be and that's kind of where I think it's going too. Is I think that's where I come up with this concept of a convergence type of approach. Is being a content creator now involves lots of different aspects, and then Gabriel has a comment. I have crossed feelings about having video in a podcast, and that's a very important point. Is that people out there like to consume however they like to consume the content. If they want to listen to audio, there's audio. If they want to watch video, they can watch video. And having that choice, I think, is what that research was really telling us. It's not that video was like dominating the audience growth for a podcast. It was more like you're giving people the full spectrum of choice.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it always worth just remembering that actually the same content can work on both. It's one of the things that I'm fascinated by TV companies, not necessarily understanding that, if you're watching, America's Got Talent or, Idol shows, all those sorts of things, those are actually radio shows with pictures in most cases. And I don't really understand why more TV companies aren't producing more audio versions of their show. I know that the David Letterman show used to be broadcast on US radio, as well as TV, because it worked absolutely fine on the radio as well. And so I think, there are real, options there as well. It's always nice as well just to see feedback. Hello, IMJ Designs, who says, could you increase your mic gain a bit, please? Well, I found the setting in StreamYard that says, do that for me. So hopefully I'm a little bit louder now.
That's good.
That's always handy too.
Well, both of us are kind of a little bit soft-spoken guys. So I have to turn my gain up a lot too here, especially with my SM7B. So I have to ramp it up a little bit.
I'm learning my new, I have a fancy new microphone, which is the Ethos. It's a very fancy, there you go, look.
What's that? Oh, yeah.
It's the Ethos from Earthworks Audio, which is a very, very fancy thing. And up until this point, I've only been using USB mics, and so this is a proper XLR thing.
Oh, you got the
Focusrite
full meal deal there.
Yes, I've got the Focusrite Scarlett and all of that. So I'm busy learning how all of this stuff works as well. So so it's probably my fault. But there you go.
Well, you've been able to make it work with the USB mic, and I think there's a takeaway for that. It's kind of okay to use some of these mics. I know I have some of them behind me on my shelf, over here, that have both ability, the XLR as well as the USB, and they both work fine. It just depends on what you need them for, right? If you have a Rodecaster, you have a Focusrite or one of those type of interfaces, XLR works great too. So
absolutely,
So I wanted to mention too, before I get too far into the show, which I'm almost a half hour in, but that at the end of the show, I'm going to do a StreamYard merch giveaway. So enter the hashtag #TheYard into your comment field in your preferred listening or viewing app that you're using here, and I'll see if I can find an example here of that. And I forgot to trigger the scrolling banner.
Rick has already stuck it in. Oh yes, look at that.
Yeah, that actually talks about what you have to do to enter the giveaway. So, and I also wanted to briefly mention too that if you wanted to see what's new at StreamYard, new features, new functions, just go to new.streamyard.com, and that usually, it's almost like a blog that has a bunch of listings of new features that are available in the platform. So if you're a user of StreamYard, you can certainly get the information you need, so the next time you use it that there's something over there that you can play around with. So, but let's let's dive into it a little bit, James, and start talking about what you're seeing in the international realm right now. And we had
Mm,
mentioned this a little bit before we went live, was the aspect that what we're seeing in the United States as far as economic impacts, layoffs, changes in the medium aren't necessarily um, reflected overseas and in other countries around the world. I think we tend to get a little insular in our views based on being in the US and not really understanding what's going on around the world. But
mm.
why don't you tell us a little bit of that? What's different about what's going on in the US versus what's going on outside of the US?
Well, I think the US has seen, tremendous growth in terms of podcasting, and with tremendous growth comes an awful lot of money that is piled
Right.
into the industry as well. And so, from that point of view, you've been able to look at the podcast industry globally and go, well, it's growing incredibly in the US, but potentially grew a little bit too fast. And what we've probably seen over the last 6 months is a bit of a correction in terms of staff numbers and money being spent in the industry in the US, but also a correction in some of the strategies behind things. So it used to be that Spotify would sign everybody up to be exclusive. Now Spotify have realized that actually better for both the creators and also for their business is if they make podcasts available everywhere on any
Yeah.
RSS app, and that's where they've ended up moving to. So we've seen quite a lot of changes, both in terms of money, in terms of staffing levels, in terms of strategy in the US, whereas possibly because Europe and Asia and other places have been a little bit slower to get going. We've been spotting what's been going on in the US, and we've been spotting what to copy and what not to copy, dare I say. And
Right.
so I suspect that what we're actually seeing, I remember seeing you a couple of years ago, Rob, when you came over to the podcast show in London. And I think, I think it took me by surprise and you by surprise how big it was. What a big, vibrant show that was, how many people were actually there, and all of the different companies and industries involved in that particular show.
Yeah.
And I think, it's sort of, a truth that some people assume that podcasting is quite small outside of the US, but actually, it is very large. It's just been growing in a slightly different way. And what we've been seeing recently is a lot of M&A activity in Europe, a lot of companies who've been, purchasing things, who've been growing quite aggressively in Europe, and we're seeing podcasting growing particularly fast in the Asian area as well. So it's a very different world, and I think if you were to say that podcasting is contracting slightly, then it is in the US, but I don't think it is in other parts of the world. I think we're still in a growth period, and I think that that's probably good news for all of us, as we're actually seeing podcasting not just being a US thing, but being even more of a global thing than it has been in the past.
And I think you've really helped that develop too, because visibility and information sharing on an international global scale, which is what your newsletter does every day, I think really fosters that connection. But it is interesting though. It's almost like outside of the U.S. is in rapid pursuit of catching up to the U.S. But maybe they can, like you said earlier, they can catch up in a way that can avoid all the pitfalls that we've run into. It's almost like we
Yeah.
took all of the arrows here in the U.S. for what is to come outside of the U.S.
Well,
Right.
it's your incredibly capitalist, country.
Right.
No, but I think there is something to be said for that. I think, I find it fascinating that listening to a number of large podcasts here in Australia, I hear them going to a commercial break, followed by a half-second pause, followed by "Welcome back," because nobody's bothering to sell the advertising into Australia. I mean, that's a good starting point, in that there are lots of people who are listening to shows across the world who are, very good to advertise to. Podcast advertising is a fascinating model in that it is impervious to ad blockers. Ad blockers don't work, and also it can be very personalized if you want it to be. And I think that there's real opportunity there, but also real opportunity in looking and seeing what is capable in other languages, as well. There's there's a number of interesting companies in Europe whose job is basically to take hit podcasts in English and translate those into other languages, whether it's Spanish, obviously, which still has a massive audience, or whether it's French, German, some of the Nordic languages, and various other things. Real opportunities there, because actually, if a format works, it works everywhere. If a show works, it should work everywhere. And similarly, if you have a look at some of the stuff that Wondery has been doing in taking some of their shows and essentially doing what TV does, selling the format to other podcast publishers in other countries. So Business Wars is a great example of that, where Business Wars in the US is all about US companies, Coke versus Pepsi, that sort of thing. They then sold Business Wars to a broadcaster and publisher in one of the Arab states, and it was talking about two large Arab countries, companies who are fighting against each other, and then they sold the format to a Japanese broadcaster. And they did Nintendo versus Sony or something like that. So, I think that there's real opportunities there, but I think also, that there's been some interesting, obviously the EU is very hot on its privacy. It's very keen to make sure that that there is proper competition in the area. That's one of the reasons why Apple is rushing out an iOS release that's potentially a little bit too early. That's got something to do with the EU's rules on there as well. And so, that has obviously changed a little bit of podcasting in these areas as well. So, I would almost argue that podcasting in Europe and in Asia is still in quite considerable growth, and podcasting in the US has had its challenges over the last year. Challenges really in terms of the business, not in terms of audience. We're seeing, we're seeing the total amount of people, and hopefully we will see this at the end of March with Edison's Infinite Dial. We're seeing the amount of people listening to podcasts still going up. It's just that from a business point of view, there've been a few things, a few landmines, strewn in our way that we've needed to avoid.
Yeah, I do wonder if we're seeing since the audience is still growing, but there's fewer shows publishing active episodes like on a weekly basis or whatever, is that we're seeing a shift to audiences to create larger shows. And the ones that are already big are getting bigger, right? And they're getting more support from advertisers. Now, if you look at the podcast industry through the lens of advertising and monetization, you kind of get a different view of it versus looking through the lens of like an independent content creator that's not necessarily focused on advertising, right? Which has always been like half of the market, at least over the past few years. It's been around, branded podcasts, ones that have been done because they're hobbies or they're in support of another kind of monetization strategy or a business of sorts. So how do we think about what's happening maybe with smaller podcasters in the context of growth as you think about, the US as well as overseas? And I know a lot of people that watch this show are usually independent creators, ones that are maybe just starting a show, getting started using StreamYard to produce shows, or maybe not using StreamYard, maybe using a competitor or something like that. How do you think the content creator community should think about what they're doing now? And is there a different attitude they need to bring to be able to grow audience now. I've got some ideas on it, but I was just curious what your thoughts are. Oh, looks like I lost James, so he should be back here soon. I think he had a bandwidth disruption, but yeah, I'm curious to hear what James' thoughts is around getting more independent creators, getting more creators that are not affiliated with big media companies involved in podcasting and how they can grow their show and where the opportunities are. And I think it's definitely a challenging environment right now, as we've seen a lot of the economic support go behind big shows, and we're seeing kind of some struggles that are happening with smaller shows being able to garner audience and having that opportunity to actually grow as well, and to achieve that monetary benefit that I think a lot of people would like to have at their podcast. I think we do have like half of the podcast space that is not monetizing right now, but I think a large percentage of them would like to monetize. So it's just a matter of having some ways that audience can grow. So if that audience that's growing in the medium can be um, surfaced to help smaller shows grow as well. So I wanted to bring up also a comment in here too. I think it came in. Um, yeah, here it is. Or a question. Carlos writes, I have built a platform for video podcasts networks where they can be side by side with smart TV platforms. A focus on engagement and controlling one's brand. So, I think it's an interesting time for video podcasting as we look forward. And I do think that we're going to see a lot more shows embrace video. And this is where I believe, kind of the little bit window of opportunity is to create a show that is doing both. And I'm not sure that you have to I think some people will say that you have to create kind of different content for video and for audio. But I think if you produce the show, not unlike what I'm doing with this show, as one cohesive content production that's a live stream, or it can be recorded too. I think it can be repurposed as an audio program as well as a video program, and and I think a platform like a StreamYard is certainly helps you have a better kind of viewer experience with the show. So I think it definitely helps on that side. And then Rick Savoya wrote too. Sometimes it's a better position to be a second wave of a technology or medium rather than the first. In the same way that early adopters have found the bugs in a system that can be ironed out for the next generation of adopters. So I do think that the opportunity for video podcasting now is better than it was back in the 2008, 9, 10 timeframe when video podcasting was pretty big and popular at the time. Whole media companies were started. Now we're kind of doing it at a time when bandwidth is ubiquitous. Bandwidth is more inexpensive now, so the delivery of video is more economic now than it's really ever been. And so I think that's the opportunity going forward. And I think the younger generation has also embraced video in a more increased way. And so let me pop up some more here. I've got another question that came in. Question: what was the website that you used to see podcast stats you used on the show with Roberto? I think what you're referring to is the podcast index. And let me pull that up on the screen here. I can probably bring that up really quick and show you, but it's um, it's actually a really good glimpse into what's actually happening. Let me just pull that up here. and pull it up on the screen so everybody can see that. It's at podcastindex.org. And so here, let me get this. Oh, looks like James is back. I'll pull him up on the screen here. Here it is. So, James, I went solo on you for a little bit, and
You did.
I have a question that was brought up about the stats that I showed a couple weeks ago on the show from the Podcast Index around how many active podcasts are in the medium. So you can see this now. So the Podcast Index is showing, and this is a platform that's been around for a few years now, and they're aggregating as many feeds, RSS feeds, as they can find, and out there, and they're actually ranking them or rating them based on frequency of publishing. So as you can see, that 14,720 number is the number of podcasts that published an episode in the last 3 days. And then there's a 10-day number there of 241,000 that have published a new episode in the last 10 days. So somewhere in there is where, James got his number on his newsletter at about 200. I think it was 209,000. James was the last number I saw. So is it
something like that? And I'm now talking to you through the magic of my mobile phone. So who knows? Who knows what might happen?
It seems to be working. So
yeah. I mean, I find that data is more helpful when you end up having a look at it over a period of time. So hidden away in our studio chat, Rob, I've sent you a link to the Podcast Business Journal, which is a weekly newsletter which I also write.
Yeah, right.
And what that's got on it is it's got a little graph which actually shows where we've been as an industry in terms of active shows. So it shows the last 30 days rather than the last 7. But this ends up showing, a pretty obvious jump at the beginning of this year, which is nice in comparison to where we've been. Podcasting always has ebbs and flows and changes in terms of how it works. But in terms of so if you hit the data link up at the top right, and then you click on I think it's called creation, something like that, podcast creation,
right?
Yeah,
there it is.
Then that ends up, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see a beautiful graph. Hopefully
beautiful.
There you go. But you can see that there was a real inflection point in January, where the amount of shows that were being made actively started going up again. And part of that is due to holidays, of course, that happen in both November in your country and December in most areas. But also, there are other reasons behind that increase as well. But I think that's a useful thing to end up seeing as well.
Yeah, that's fairly seasonal. What's going on there? It's the lowest point was January 22nd, but then it starts to charge uphill as you move towards February.
Which of course January 22nd. If you're looking at the total podcast updated in the last 30 days, then that's a time that goes back to December 22nd, so right before the Christmas break. So yeah, absolutely. Correct. So you're going to see quite a jump in there. And these are pages that I've done, pages that I put together which pull data from various places. Also in this section, if you're interested in comparing your podcast with other shows, Then also in this section, you'll actually find download numbers for all kinds of shows which are sharing their download information on OP3 under there, the podcast downloads. And it's sorted in terms of category. So if you do an arts show and you want to compare yourself with somebody else, or a business show or whatever, then you can actually go in there and see all of those, all of that information as well. And I think that that's one thing that this organization probably, that this industry probably hasn't had, is that, way of being able to compare what you're doing with other people out there. So all of these numbers are 30-day downloads, and you can compare yourself with all kinds of individual organizations. But as you can see, there are some podcasts here that have done 15 downloads in the last 30 days. There are some which have done thousands and thousands of downloads. So if you're looking at all of the data which comes out showing, I've got 1 million downloads in the last 30 days.
Oh, there's one right there.
Yeah, and there is one right there, but actually most of them are not are not anywhere near as big. Yeah, which is always important to end up knowing. And if you click through, then you can actually see exactly where those downloads are coming from, how individual episodes have done, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of really useful information in there, which there you go. So you can see that particular show clearly had a very important release in the middle of last month. So there's a bunch of data, and I would, for anybody that is producing a podcast, I would always say, make sure that it's listed in OP3. It allows you, which is what this service is, it allows you to compare your show with others, but also really helps all of us understand what's going on in the industry, as we can actually have a look in much more detail in where traffic is coming from and who's actually taking part.
Yeah, so this is an interesting stat here. I'm trying to zoom in on it a little bit so we can get a good glimpse at it.
It's always hard to
apps
do.
Was the one that I was looking for. I think it's further down below.
Further down. And this is app data, which is put together with open data, so anybody can actually see how this is worked out. But so for this particular show, Spotify's in the lead with 30-something%, I think, of all downloads, and Apple Podcasts next. And all of the rest, Amazon Music and everybody else, are absolutely tiny in comparison. Which is always interesting to end up seeing. But each individual podcast is different. I get virtually no downloads through Spotify. Not quite sure what I did to anger the Spotify gods, but there we go. But this comes back to what you were saying earlier. On this particular show, GeoSavan is the 5th highest app. Now, GeoSavan is a podcast app, in India. It's one of the Indian Spotify's. So there are real opportunities outside of the US in terms of different apps, in terms of different ways that people are consuming shows. And that's obviously worthwhile bearing in mind as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, the distribution, especially with this show, because this show, I think, tends to gravitate towards outside of the U.S. consumption, is what I see in its stats. And it totally makes sense that Spotify would come up number one, because it has apps that are available on Android, where the Apple Podcasts app is not available as much outside of the U.S. as it is in the U.S. So if your show is consumed in the U.S., predominantly, it's probably going to be strong on Apple Podcasts. But if it's consumed internationally, or it's an international podcast, you're probably going to see higher numbers from Spotify.
Yeah, because Android is very big in a few countries, but I mean, if you look at if you look at the US, it's sort of roughly 60% iPhone, 40% Android.
Right.
If you look into the UK, by the way, is very similar, as is here in Australia. But once you get out of those English-speaking countries, it's very much more focused on Android. So much of South America, for example, 80% Android use. And because Apple, for whatever reason, haven't released an Apple Podcasts app onto Android, they have an Apple TV app, they have an Apple Music app. One would assume that they are working on an Apple Podcasts app as well, but that's not currently available. And so therefore, actually, an Apple Podcasts link does nothing for you, really. And so Spotify at the moment, with the closure of Google Podcasts, what Google are essentially doing is that they are giving that traffic away to Spotify, which is a strange plan of theirs, but
yeah, it is
a plan, I suppose.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then this stat here is interesting too. I mean, so even this program is getting good traffic from the United States, but number 2 is China, of all places.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's interesting.
Well, China does very good. If I remember rightly, this particular show that you clicked into was a business
Correct.
podcast. Business podcasts seem to do very well in China, very well in India. In order for you to appear in the Apple Podcasts directory in China, you need to be allow listed. So they actually need to tick a box saying this is okay to be made available in China, which is just worthwhile knowing because of the different media laws that they have there. But certainly India, you always see a very high amount of consumption of personal improvement and of business shows. So, again, it's different in different countries, to have a look at. So all of this data is available to you. And, were you to have a look at my data, which is available through this service, and you'll see very, very different consumption, very, very different countries, and so on. And I think, it is fascinating seeing what the differences are and what you can actually learn, out of that.
Yeah, and then the podfather of podcasting has his stats in here too, Mr. Adam Curry, and I believe the keeper is his wife, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So he has some stats in here too. So this is a little bit, this whole sharing of stats is kind of something that has been, I'm not quite sure how to portray it, but it's always been something that it was like, has been kind of shunned in the podcasting space.
Some people
years.
really don't want to share their data. Some people really don't want to share what they're doing, and possibly because they're telling advertisers one thing, and they're getting different numbers.
There couldn't be any fraud going on with that at all.
As if that would ever happen anywhere.
Right.
But but I think from the point of view, I mean, so personally, I think if you're asking for donations from your audience, then you should be really open in terms of what you do, in terms of downloads, in terms of newsletter readers, in terms of anything that you possibly can do. And if you're a public funded organization, maybe you're the BBC, maybe you're an NPR affiliate, however it works, again, you should be as open as possible with your stats on that. And I think, if there's one thing that I wish I could change is making sure that for public organizations, keeping all of your stats public would be a really helpful thing to do. Not necessarily sure it would happen for everyone. It'd be great to see this particular show being measured by OP3. But
I'm okay with that. I mean, I just got it launched and I'm in control of it, and it's not someone else in control. So,
but I think that would be really interesting, and the more open data that there is out there, that means that we can begin to understand a little bit more when things change. And I think if you were to have a look back at last year, there was a big change that Apple Podcasts made, which they didn't really tell anybody about, but there was a big change that they made in September time. And it was only people beginning to actually dig into the data that made Apple essentially admit the change that they actually had done. And I think, again, it's up to us to keep the industry honest and to keep the industry open as much as we possibly can. So from that point of view, I'm always very keen to have a look at keeping things, as open as possible.
Yeah, this question from Daily Sports History is a good one. I think it's a reasonable question, but it is kind of missing some information about. The question is, with Google Podcast closing, are you able to see stats on YouTube Music? And they're kind of two different things. James, I don't know if you wanted to mention about
yes,
it.
and yeah, I mean, I can answer the question in that yes, you can see the stats, but there are two different ways of listening to a podcast on YouTube Music. So YouTube Music is the audio app that YouTube have made available. It's a pre-install on all Android phones, and you can listen in two different ways. You can either listen through YouTube, so somebody uploads a video, or YouTube will grab your RSS feed and upload a piece of audio into their system. So there's one way. That's one way of doing it, and you will notice that on every YouTube page, you can see the stats for that. They're public for every single YouTube show. So that's really easy to spot what the stats are there. But there is another way as well, which is YouTube Music also plays podcasts from RSS, if you happen to know the RSS feed. Now, those numbers will appear in your podcast host. Now, they will probably appear at the moment as a unknown player, because it needs the podcast hosts to update their stuff. But you can listen to any podcast that you like using YouTube Music. One easy way of doing that, there's a website that I built earlier on in the year with the excellent name of RSS2YTM.net. That's RSS number 2 YTM.net. And what that allows you to do very easily is type in the podcast that you're interested in, and it will show you how to add that onto YouTube Music. It is way more clunky than it needs to be, because that's just the way that Google have ended up building it. But that essentially means that you will then have two different sets of numbers, one from YouTube properly, and YouTube Studio has some amazing numbers and some amazing consumption detail that is really helpful. And then you've got your other numbers from your podcast host for people using your RSS feed to have a listen. There's a whole page all about this on the Podnews website, podnews.net/articles. If you do a search for podcast stats or something like that, then you'll find it. Lots and lots of information there. But yeah, YouTube Music is it's a bit interesting to see.
It's a little messy, isn't it?
Yeah, messy is one way of putting it. Yeah.
So so James, what was the URL to that again? I was going to bring it. It was RSS
number 2 YTM.net.
Oh,
RSS
YTM.
to YTM YouTube Music.net.
That's .net.
Yeah. And that's a simple, straightforward page that just helps a user be able to listen to whatever show that they want to within the YouTube Music app. Amusingly, YouTube Music doesn't deal with video in an RSS feed.
Right.
Genius. Another triumph, YouTube.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's definitely some confusion going on is probably a nice way of saying it about what's going on. It's especially with stats around submitting RSS feeds to YouTube Music. It's like, is every hosting platform going to get stats from that? Because I thought that they were just
Yeah,
Is that a
so
pass through, or are they capturing an
it's
actual
not a pass
episode?
through, no. So they,
Right.
if you tell YouTube to ingest your RSS feed into their system, then all that they do is they download your audio and they make a video from it and
Right.
stick it up on YouTube. So there's no pass through, which means that there's no dynamic advertising, but it also means that there's no numbers that your podcast app can get hold of.
Right.
So from that point of view, and by the way, YouTube also say that you're not allowed certain forms of advertising in that as well.
Yeah.
So that there's an issue there, with that too. The only way that your podcast host can ever get your stats ingested into its systems is if you start logging into YouTube through your podcast host and accept some vague things. And I think Libsyn is the only podcast host which is actually pulling in YouTube stats, and they pull them in separately. Because they don't measure the same thing, so therefore they pull them in, completely separately. Yeah, so this page is really built for podcast listeners to find a podcast that they want to have a listen to in the YouTube Music app. So if you were to search for your favorite podcast in here, then it will actually give you the steps to add it to the YouTube Music app, which is ideally would just be one button, but sadly it doesn't quite work that way. So if you were to type in podcast tips and hit the look up podcast thing, then you'll find lots of different shows in there. I'm sure that your show will be in here, Rob. He hopes
At some point.
at some point.
Yeah, I mean it's newly listed, so things aren't fully propagated everywhere. But
no, exactly. So this comes out of but you could click on one of these and you could see how the thing works. But there you go. It's one of those days today, clearly.
Well,
but
it's all right.
I mean, what YouTube is doing, I think it's such a missed opportunity for Google to close Google Podcasts. We know that lots of people use it.
It just feels like that they're doing something that is counterproductive. They're creating a lot of confusion in the market around what's going on with it, how it works, where's the data coming from.
It's very messy, and unfortunately, Google being Google aren't very good at talking to people about it either. In fact, if you remember 3 or 4 years ago, I ended up hosting a session at Podcast Movement about Google Podcasts, because Google came up to me and they said, "We've got this session, but we're not allowed to speak on stage. Are you able to stand there and tell people what Google Podcasts is?" And I said, "Yes, very happy. What is it?" And they said, "Oh, well, we can't really tell you that either." So I had to make a presentation about what Google Podcasts was, which was a strange experience.
It was about a year and a half ago. I was at On Air Fest, I believe, in Brooklyn.
Which is going on right now. Yeah,
when the YouTube folks got up on stage and presented this whole podcast concept at this little tiny event on Air Fest that it isn't really attended by very many people. And I captured the video from it and I posted it to Twitter, and I don't think that the YouTube team liked that I posted everything as far as their full video. So it's almost like they make a public announcement, but they don't really want it to be that public, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So
and I think what they're doing is they're not really playing in the open podcast ecosystem. We've spent the last 5 years proving to Spotify that open is best. And Spotify is now pretty well, agreed with that, and has made all of their stuff open, using access the way that it should be used. But sadly, YouTube, and I understand why, but YouTube is probably the opposite of that. And interestingly, Google Podcasts was a perfect podcast app for that sort of thing. It was open, it used RSS properly. It was a decent, if unadventurous, podcast app. That was actually growing quite a lot in usage, and was something that you could always guarantee would be there. If you have an Android phone, the Google Podcasts code, if not the app, was always there. So you could always play a podcast on an Android phone. Now we don't have that luxury anymore. I can't give you a link that opens a podcast on an Android phone anymore, which I think is so
It's such a mistake.
short-sighted. Yeah, because there's no way into YouTube Music in that same way. So I think it's a real shame. But there we are.
Yeah, I'm really, really disappointed in it, because I spent a lot of time going to meetings with Google in the early days when they were formulating their strategy with Google Podcasts. I used to live up in Seattle, and I used to go meet with the team in Seattle to help them kind of build that thing out. And a lot of the team members would get together, and we'd all talk about what's happening in the industry to help educate them about, where the opportunities were and where it was going. And I had a lot of, positive feelings about what they were trying to accomplish. And it's such a platform with such scale and such opportunity.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
But the other thing I wanted to mention too, and I know we're starting to run out of time, but was the Podcast 2.0 project, which I know you and Daniel J. Lewis worked on this website that hopefully will draw some clarity to some folks about what's going on with this and why it's important. And I'll zoom in here so it's a little easier for people to see it if they're watching the video. But trying to make podcasting better. I know that the industry faced some criticism from some leaders from Spotify, might be where most of it came from, about the concept of innovation in podcasting around RSS and the lack of that. So this whole project kind of started as part of the Podcast Index, which we brought up earlier. But it's an effort to add some new tags to RSS to better bring features to the listening experience for podcasting. And I don't know, James, do you want to share kind of high-level view of what's been going on here with this and what this website is trying to accomplish?
So I mentioned earlier that when podcasting started in 2004, you were one of the first podcasters. You didn't have to produce a image thumbnail for your podcast because that wasn't part of the standard. And when Apple jumped into the industry, they extended RSS, and one of the new features that they added into RSS was a thumbnail, and by the way, a category, as well. Those are both Apple ideas. So for someone from Spotify to turn around and say RSS doesn't allow us to change things and to innovate and move on, shows just that they didn't understand what the industry was. I think is as far as that. Where we are now is that there is a new part of RSS, a new extension of RSS, which we're calling Podcasting 2.0, and this is the website at podcasting2.org. And Podcasting 2.0 really allows you to add additional features into podcasting that some podcast apps out there are using. So the obvious example here is transcripts. If you are producing your own transcripts, then you can use a new feature in a Podcasting 2.0 RSS feed, which allows you to give that transcript to Apple Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts will, as of next week, show that transcript in the app. That's a good example of a Podcasting 2.0 idea which has been implemented by Apple. But there are plenty more of those as well. There's everything from payment mechanisms to better ways of monitoring where people are listening, to better chapters which are far richer in terms of the amount of information that you can get into them, and all kinds of other things in there as well. And this website, Podcasting 2.org, is really there just to help explain that. The idea is really to help explain it in as easy and hopefully not techie way as possible. Not sure that we've yet succeeded, but we're busy rewriting things and making the language as easy as we possibly can, so that listeners can understand what the benefit of podcasting 2.0 is, so that developers can understand how easy it is to actually develop for, and so that podcast hosting companies can better support parts of this. And I'm glad that you've scrolled to this section of the page, because there's a ton of additional features and additional benefits that podcasting 2.0, that the podcast namespace enables. One of them that I'm particularly excited about is around comments and making those comments work, so that you can actually,
across
across
listening
apps.
platforms. Right.
Yeah, so that you can actually see what people are saying, and try and understand what all of this stuff is actually, what people are actually saying about your particular show. So there's a ton of information there, and and this is, I think Rick is making a great point on screen at the moment. He says, to be fair to Apple, at the time I don't think anyone really knew where podcasting was going to go, and those getting into it just wanted to get in on it and see where it went. I think that's absolutely fair. I think the reason why, from my understanding, and Rob, you'll know better than most, but from my understanding, Apple was really getting into podcasting because it saw that it could sell more iPods that way,
Right.
because it could actually get more content into the iTunes store that way. But I think it did show that that RSS was changeable and that you could add additional features. And I think Apple did a really good job of doing that. And what excites me now is that Apple is using some of these new features from the podcast namespace, particularly around transcripts.
That's the first one that they've adopted, right?
Yeah, it's the second one. They
What's
also
the second
adopted. One? They also adopted very tediously a thing called Podcast TXT, which was a very complicated thing to explain. But they supported that. But the transcript is really the first one, which is in there. Lifestyle and Living ask, do all podcast hosts support all of these features? And the answer is no. And really, that's why this website is there to help, podcasting2.org. Some of the podcast hosts out there, Captivate is very good, RSS.com is very good. I'm an advisor for RSS, I should say. But, some of them are very good at supporting a lot of these features, Buzzsprout as well. Some of them have been a little bit less interested in supporting some of them, but I think and Blueberry, which this show is hosted by, has been one of those that has been really leading the pack in terms of their support. It is really, I think, a differentiator in between podcast hosts, that there are some podcast hosts out there which are really jumping into this, and there are some podcast hosts that aren't, and it's an absolutely fine choice. You do.
Captivate is another one.
Yeah, Captivate's doing a tremendous job, and I'm very good friends with the folks there. And from their point of view, it adds support headaches for them. It adds various things, but yeah, it's a really useful additional tool out there to do interesting and fun things. You're now showing all of the different apps which are available out there. Apps like Podcast Guru or Fountain are really good at highlighting some of the opportunities with these new features, and it's well worth just giving them a go. They might not replace your current podcast app right now, but they're certainly really good at beginning to show what some of these things are capable of, and even Apple Podcasts on that.
Yeah, so I was going to say that's good that pops up in there. That kind of shows a little bit of leadership on the part of Apple Podcasts, because one of the backstories about this whole thing with Apple is that the industry has been really kind of controlled by Apple from the standpoint of technical standards for many years, from the standpoint of what's called a namespace, which is basically tags that are can be added to the RSS 2.0 spec, which is it's really just about metadata is what Apple put out a specification that all RSS feeds need to have these certain tags in there for certain kinds of textual content, right? It could be a link to an image, or it could be just a description or a name or an email address or something like that in the RSS feed. And when Apple put out a new namespace, which happened multiple times over the years, the whole industry just kind of like jumped on it, clamored on it, and couldn't have done it faster, right?
Most of the whole
Right.
of the industry, yes.
Right, exactly. And then now
And you knew very
it
much.
flipped a little bit.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, you knew very much which the podcast hosts to avoid were, just by looking at, are you supporting some of the new features that Apple has put in place? And if they weren't, then you go, maybe SoundCloud, I'll leave you for a better one. But yeah, I find it really interesting because, this does essentially allow podcasting to continue to innovate. There are a whole host of features, some of which will fail and crash and burn, and that's absolutely fine, and some of which will do really, really well. By the way, if you are looking for a replacement for Google Podcasts that does the same sort of job and works really well, I would recommend AntennaPod, which was on your screen a second ago. It's free and it works with RSS. It's a really good, well-built, completely open app, and there are plenty of others to have a look at, but AntennaPod is the closest to Google Podcasts, closest to the sort of features that you were used to and the sort of simplicity that you were used to. So if you're hunting for a new podcast app, don't go using Spotify or any of that. Try AntennaPod first, because it's a proper podcast app which is available for your Android phone and works really well.
So this is it here. It's AntennaPod, and you just go in and you click to download.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and away you go.
I don't believe it yet. Only works on Android. Is that what you're saying?
It's just an Android app. So if you're looking for a replacement for Google Podcasts, because let's face it, pretty well everybody using Google Podcasts was on Android, then this will be the one that I would probably recommend. A few of the new things that it does, they're working on transcripts right now, which is really exciting. But they also support enhanced chapters. I think we call them super chapters on the podcasting2.org website. So it supports that already, and it also supports searching not just through Apple Podcasts, but searching through other podcast directories, such as the Podcast Index, which you were talking about while my internet fell over, and a few other directories as well. So it's a really good, capable app. I believe it even works in the car as well if you have Android Auto. So it won't work in your fancy Tesla, I'm afraid, Rob. But nevertheless, it'll work in most people's sensible cars.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of stuck with the Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those are really my only two choices.
Well, at least they've stuck Apple Podcasts in there now.
Yeah, well, it's a convenient interface and it works really well. But yeah, I mean, this is what's interesting about this page, James, is that this is showing innovation in the podcasting space and how we're kind of have the potential of putting some pressure on these bigger platforms to continue to embrace some innovation, which they all claim that they want to support innovation in podcasting. Let's hold their feet to the fire on that one, right? So it's and oftentimes that innovation comes from proprietary deployments of technology on these platforms, and so
it's certainly easier to ignore what everybody else is doing and just do your own thing. That's certainly easier from a product point of view, but I do find it interesting seeing much of the industry actually looking back at open systems, open RSS, and going, you know what, maybe there wasn't anything wrong with that anyway.
Gabriel, I don't really have a presentation per se. Most of what I pulled up on the screen has been just screenshots of websites. So I think the archive of this show will be in a video that will be available off of the podcast feed, or also available for replay at YouTube and a lot of other platforms like X and LinkedIn and those kind of things. So you should be able to get all those links if you just go back and scroll through it. But maybe I can post in the show notes the URLs to all of the websites that we've shown on the show today. So
Sure.
yeah, that is definitely possible.
Yeah.
And then
I think that makes sense.
yeah, so is it available as a PDF? No, not currently.
Nobody.
But it's not a bad idea, though.
Apart from you.
Right. Exactly.
What's the best podcast app, Rob?
Oh, what's the best podcast app for me?
Lydia was asking.
I kind of enjoy the Apple Podcast app, and I'm happy to see them kind of starting to embrace podcasting 2.0. And I know some of the people over there and have been a big advocate of Apple. I've been to their corporate offices many times over the years, and have followed actually multiple sets of team members over there over the years.
Yes,
there's been a little bit of a turnover over there. But that happens at a lot of these tech companies. Yeah. I said, please, I've had a video issue lately, even when I still used wire on my internet. Well, yeah, that's always the challenge, right? Is bandwidth and connection speeds. As we've kind of progressed with this video, the kind of bandwidth consumption requirements have escalated as well. I mean, a lot of people are doing 1080p or 4K, and that requires a lot of bandwidth. And if your bandwidth provider doesn't provide you that much bandwidth, you're going to struggle. There's just no doubt about that. So, and James, the questions keep coming in. Thank you, James. Yeah, what's the next best app for podcasts? Which of the apps do you prefer, or do you prefer not to say for political reasons?
No, I'm fine to upset people. So I've recently moved from Android. I used Android for the last 10 years, and I've recently moved over to iOS. But unlike you and Max, Rob, I'm going to stick with it. So that should be okay. So what I would say, if you're using iOS, the Apple Podcast app is great. The new version, which is out in a week or so, which includes transcripts, is really, really good. So I would definitely use that. If you like your fast speed, listening back to podcasts faster than normal speed, then Overcast is an amazing app for that.
Yeah, I agree.
Marco has done an incredible job with the playback function there. And if you're using Android, I would use either AntennaPod, which I just mentioned, or for both Android and iOS, the Pocket Casts app is very good as well. Run by Automatic, who are the folks who own WordPress, so hopefully has a pretty good future. That works fantastically. They've not dived in too much into Podcasting 2.0 yet, and I'm rather hoping that they do so. But that's a good paid service if you want to end up using the Pocket Casts app. But AntennaPod probably number one on Android, and on iOS, the Apple Podcast app is a pretty good app. So
yeah. It looks like, James, you have a fan.
Excellent.
We need James on again. Great info and knowledge. And I guess my comeback for that was he's got his own podcast too, so you can go.
Yeah. I've got
to him
two.
As much as you want.
I've got two. Just search for the word Pod News in your favorite podcast app. And of course, you should be getting my newsletter, podnews.net.
So do you see yourself trying to do stuff on the video side more, James, as you look to the future?
I can't stand doing video.
You can't stand doing video except for when you come on my shows, right?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I'll occasionally play around with the video side. I think that the content that I make doesn't work very well on video. And I've been working in radio for over 30 years now, and so very used to not having video cameras pointed at me. So that's always a good start. But I think for some individual shows, for some individual formats, it works fantastically well. What I found really interesting using YouTube Music to listen to podcasts as I was earlier on in the year, what I found fascinating is being able to find some of the videos of the shows that I have been listening to in audio for many years, and suddenly realizing, oh wow, this is available in video as well, and do I want to watch the video version of these particular shows? And so I found that really interesting. I think from my point of view, I make a daily podcast. That's a 5-minute show called Pod News Daily, which is everything to do with podcasting and everything else. And I would love to do a little bit more of that in video, but it's very difficult to make a interesting video that works well that I can also put together really, really fast, because that's my other sort of side on that.
Yeah,
as well.
speed for you is very important. I remember kind of traveling with you a little bit through Europe the last time I was in Europe, and
yes,
I was just amazed at how fast you got your newsletter out, because you've automated so many things with your newsletter, and then how fast and how versatile you were, and where you were recording your podcast too.
Yes, I think there may have been a time when you and I were in an airport lounge, and I think
correct.
And I think I ended up just sort of sitting and doing the podcast. But the good news is it only takes 4 minutes, so it's only embarrassing for 4 minutes.
Where was that? I think that was in Copenhagen, wasn't it? I think so.
Yes, I think you could be right. Yes, I think you and I were at a conference there, but I have a very small little microphone which is only about this big that I carry around with me after the TSA ruined one of my nice microphones, and so I've been using that ever since. But I think and it's something that is worthwhile looking at in a different show. Actually, is the whole workflow thing. Making sure that your podcast has a really good workflow to make life easy and simple is a really important thing. The harder a podcast is to make, the harder it's going to be for you to do it consistently every single week. And so, the fact that you are producing this on StreamYard, the fact that you can then grab the audio and reuse this audio and video now in OpenRSS, all of that is fantastic, because it just makes life easier for you, so you can do more creative things and less of the tedious button pressing stuff. And I think that's the important thing, and that's a lot of the reason why the Pod News newsletter is the size it is, comes out the time of day that it does, and does some of the things that it does, because, I've been able to work out a workflow that makes that really easy and simple. And I think a lot of podcasters get burnt out very, very quickly because they don't necessarily understand some of the tips and tricks to get past, to make it easier for them to focus on the creativity and focus less on hitting buttons and things.
Yeah. So was it Lydia? If I see that right, or Lydia asked a question: what are some of the best equipment for a good quality podcast? So that's a pretty expansive question. There are lots of choices out there that one can look at to do it, and I guess it depends on where you are in the spectrum of getting started. But trying to keep your costs down is not necessarily a bad idea. But try and find dynamic microphones. Probably a great place to start would be like a USB based microphone. Some of the mics out there, like the Samsung Q2U or the Audio Technica ATR 2100 are great mics to start with.
Yeah, or this one, which is a little Sennheiser. You really can't go wrong with this. A little USB mic, which Yeah. So, but I mean, I would answer the question, Lydia, with probably the equipment you've already got. If you've got an okay microphone, that's fine, as long as you know how to use it, and as long as you know how to use an audio editing tool. That could be Audacity. I would recommend you use Hindenburg Pro because it's good, but you could use Audacity. That's absolutely fine too. But just as long as you understand how to use it. And I think a lot of podcasters out there think, if only I spend another $400. I mean, this microphone is worth $400. If only I spend another $400, many more people will listen to my show.
Yeah,
and the answer is no, that's absolutely not going to be the case. So focus on what you've got. Focus on making sure that you are doing it, that you are using it in the right way. And a lot of that is microphone technique, is using the audio editor, watching other people edit their shows. There are YouTube live streams of that too, and you go, oh, I hadn't considered doing it that way, and just get better at the stuff that you've got. Don't go and buy new stuff just because you think that that's going to make your show better.
Right.
You can get away with. I mean, this is this microphone for a starter is about $100 or so. It comes with a mic boom, which I'm actually using right now. Absolutely perfect for that for that sort of thing. You don't need anything more fancy unless you're doing a podcast with 4 or 5 different people in the same room, in which case that's a very different conversation.
Yes, Rick, it looks like I'm getting close to a 2-hour podcast here, but that's not necessarily unusual for me with the shows that I do. James knows well. My other show is an hour and a half also. So, but we are stretching the envelope here, and I know there are folks here that are waiting for the giveaway at the end. But I did get a question here from Rocky about, can you use these mics by Bluetooth? No. I'll just put it that way. And I wouldn't advise that. Most Bluetooth microphones are not entirely reliable. So they can easily cut out and you'd be missing some content and wouldn't even know it. So
I did play with a wireless microphone, which wasn't a Bluetooth one, but was a wireless microphone, which was quite a cheap one, which I've reviewed on the Pod News website. If you just go and do a search for the word review, then you'll find it in there. And it's fine, but really, wires are here for a good reason.
Yeah, they are.
And so
you can rely on them. That's the reason.
Yeah. And so a decent mic, it might be that Sennheiser, it might be the Shure MV7, which is a bit more expensive, but this has the benefit of having both a XLR but also having a USB, so it enables it relatively future-proof. It enables you to try different tools and stuff like that. Any of those microphones are going to do a good job, but I would definitely plug them in and wire them up. There's one less thing to go wrong. You've just seen earlier on in this very show that relying on one internet connection doesn't always work.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. There's cutoffs. It's happened multiple times on this show. So it's just the nature of doing something live too.
To be fair to my mobile phone, my cell phone company, they've done a pretty good job of keeping this backup working, so that's been okay. Yeah, but still,
And Lydia asked a question. I have a Rodecaster Pro, 4 condenser mics, 2 Macs, 6 different stands. It's the technique, and I just can never get the sound as crisp as what I'm hearing tonight on this program. My comment to you on that would be the thing that really jumped out to me. I think that the Rodecaster Pro is exactly what I'm using here to do this. I have one of the first gen Rodecaster Pros, and they can be complicated to get configured properly. So I am applying some compression, some algorithmic sound optimization to my audio here through this microphone, but it took me a while to get this thing dialed in and set up properly. And once it's set up and dialed in and I've done all the testing, I don't touch it anymore. It just let it do its thing. And then the other thing that jumped out at me at your comment was about condenser microphones. Those are, I used to do my nationally syndicated radio show on condenser microphones, and it's because I didn't know any better, to be quite honest with you. But the sound on those things typically is terrific. The problem is that you use those mics in bad environments and they're going to sound horrible. So you really have to use condenser microphones in sound buffered environments if you want to get good audio out of them. And that's a challenge for a lot of podcasters. And that's why dynamic microphones are far more popular. That's what this microphone is. And I'm sure that's what James is using too, is a dynamic microphone, not a condenser microphone. But
this is actually a condenser.
It is a condenser.
Yeah. But quite a lot of it is down to how you use that microphone and what you use that
That's
microphone
true
for, as well.
Sure. In your room too, is your room doesn't have a lot of echo?
It's a pretty echoey room. Hence why I've been quite close to the microphone.
That's right. You got to kiss it,
because
right?
I've worked out that is the only thing. But as Rob says, there are some actual microphones. So this Shure MV7 has software on it which allows you to set EQ, which allows you to set compression. It allows you to do a lot of that stuff within the microphone. So once you've set it up, it's there and it's done. And
that's only through the USB connection, though. It's
only through the USB connection,
right? Yeah, you can't get that capability with the XLR output on that. Yeah, because I have that mic behind me on the shelf behind me. And I played around with it.
Anybody that's worked in this area for more than a couple of years has a collection of microphones, I noticed.
Yes, you can see it behind me. I've got a shotgun mic on this side up there that you can see, and then I have a bunch of other ones too. So you go through microphones over the years, right? Like I've had this SM7B since 2009. So that's how long I've had this.
I used an SM7B for the first time last week. I was actually in a podcast studio for the first time ever, in the centre of Brisbane, where I was putting together a show with Sam Sethi, who I normally do a show with, where he's at home in the UK, I'm at home here. And for the first time, we had to sit in a room together and record a show. And I knew that I couldn't do it here, so we hired a studio. It was very good. So that's not a bad option. And some people like to do that. There's no question. I mean, I hear lots of people, I don't want to do it in my own house because the sound it's going to be horrible. Yeah.
But well, James, we've definitely gone long. We've got a lot of terrific questions. Thank you so much, everybody out there that's watching, that's kept the kind of chat going and comments coming through. I think it's safe to say, James, I could probably do this show for well over 2 hours. There's no question. But I've somewhat restrained myself from that because I think about the video file I have to upload to Blueberry, and Todd's going to have a nightmare with that. So anyway, let's get to the giveaway here. For those that are still with me, you will really be probably the only one that would be acknowledging and sending me an email, hopefully, to get your prize. So let me put up on the screen my email address, that if you win the giveaway here of a StreamYard hoodie and sweatshirt, it's the same thing, and the Puddles duck little stuffed icon creature for StreamYard, please send me an email to this address with your mailing address as well as your sweatshirt size for the hoodie. So let's go ahead, and I believe we have how many entries do we have? Looks like we have 25. So
by the looks of that.
Just for,
I'm large, by the way. I'm large,
what?
Rob.
Well, did you enter, James?
I didn't.
So just at the last minute here, type in the hashtag #TheYard if you want to be included in this. I think we're losing live viewers very quickly as I move into getting close to the 2-hour window. That may be too long for some people. So anyway, looks like we're locked at 25. So let's go ahead and pull the drawing and see who wins. Da-da, 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 da-da. Right.
That's neat.
Uh,
There we go.
Mutt Nuts Crazy Craft is the winner
Crazy
of the
Crafting.
giveaway today. So thank you so much, everybody, for entering. Please
And they
send
only
me.
entered 2 minutes ago, so they've done incredibly well.
I would
to
say
be there.
so.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Very good.
So send me an email if you're still watching this, and I will get your merch sent out to you. Just give me your email, not your email, but your mailing address and your sweatshirt size, and we'll get that sent out to you ASAP. So thank you so much, James. Thank you so much for joining me on the show
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
for this marathon recording.
It's the middle of the day for me. I can do anything I like.
Well, that's true. I'm sure you have plenty of other things to do, though.
Yeah.
Knowing you, so yeah, there's probably a never-ending supply of that. But I'll be back next week with another episode Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And what time is it down in Australia right now, James?
Well, in my part of Australia, it's 20 to midday, 20 to 12.
20 to 12. So this show started for you at
10 for me.
10 a.m.
Yeah.
So it'd be 10 a.m. Friday, Australian time. So all my Australian listeners will know when to tune in.
Well, 11 a.m. in Sydney and Melbourne. 10 a.m.
Oh,
in
is it a
Brisbane.
different time zone where you're at?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think 7 a.m. in Perth. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me on the show. And if you missed any of my prior 16 episodes and you want to go check them out, it's all on demand now as a podcast. So go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe. And if not, go to Spotify. So far, I haven't seen the show up in a bunch of these other apps yet. So it's probably in AntennaPod by now, but we shall see. So thank you so much. And good night, everybody out there.